two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Justin Bloesch. He's an economist teaching in ILR at Cornell. And we will be talking about inflation. So, Justin Bloesch, what is inflation?
Uh, so in general, inflation means that prices are going up. Um, we buy things every day. It costs money to do so, and that can change over time. So usually inflation prices go up, so inflation is positive. But in general, inflation is the price that you spend on things that you buy every day goes up. Now, already when we say that, there are some very technical questions that we have to answer right away. And so you first have to ask which prices. So, maybe one day the price of eggs goes up, but then it goes down. Maybe rent goes up, right? And so then you have to say, well, if we want to know it in general, sort of how much prices went up, how do we weight these things? How do we think about the different prices and how much they go up? Also, because different people spend money on different things, right? I might buy more eggs, and maybe you buy more meat, and those prices might change over time. So, what the government produces is various statistics of that tries to summarize sort of in general, on average, how much do prices go up. So, the most common index that you've probably heard of is the Consumer Price Index. And what that does is it takes what they call a basket of goods. So basically look at what people spend their money on. How much do you spend on rent? How much do you spend on groceries and so on? And then the share of your budget that goes to a certain thing, that's the weight that it gets in this index. And then you see how much prices go up weighted by how much you spend on things. So in the Consumer Price Index, housing, for example, is around 45% of the basket. And so if, house price or if rent goes up by 10%, roughly that would make CPI go up by about 4 or 5%. So in general, what is inflation? It's prices going up. It's a little bit of a tricky question because you have to answer which prices. And so we have ways of kind of taking the average of all of those things.
And why do we get inflation?
That's a pretty deep question in and of itself. So uh, at a kind of a high level, the what inflation ends up being is a result of government activity. So uh, in the end, the governments have control about how much currency is printed, how much sort of money supply there is, um, sort of in the economy in general. It's a little more complicated than that because money is created by banks and so on. But ultimately, inflation is a byproduct both of government policy and how people interact with government policy. So that's a little bit messy sort of in general. The government institution that is tasked with managing inflation in the US is the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is a central bank. Um, Most, if not every country in the world has a central bank. And they're mandated by Congress to ensure stable prices. So there's some latitude about what stable prices mean. And the Federal Reserve has interpreted that to mean they want prices to go up on average by about 2% per year. So first of all, you could ask, why 2%? And because I think a lot of people naturally would think ideally prices just wouldn't change over time. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we usually, when the economy gets faster, people are spending more, people have lots of jobs, inflation goes up. And when you're in a recession, inflation often goes down. One of the reasons that we want to have inflation in general positive is that deflation can be particularly bad. So if prices are going down, one, people know that things will get cheaper in the future and they'll wait to buy things. So that if you're already in a kind of depressed economy, deflation can depress the economy more. The second is that if you take out a loan, and if you're in a world of deflation, so deflation means prices are going down, wages are going down, so incomes are going down. And if you took out a loan, um, and your income is falling over time, you're more likely to default. And so, in a way, having inflation being a little bit positive, that prices on average go up a little bit each year, and so incomes on average go up a little bit each year, kind of makes the whole system work a little bit better. So, in general, that's what the government tries to do. But there are lots of things that can happen that can affect inflation that can move inflation away from that 2% target.
Oh, you mentioned money supply,
Mhm.
and that reminds me that in the late 19th century, there was huge controversy about whether money should be based on gold or silver.
Mhm. Yeah, so we're in what you call a fiat system. So once upon a time, uh, you could go to governments, you have dollars, and you could say, I want in exchange for these dollars, I want gold. Um, Something that's kind of in the background of this is that money is a liability of the government. So like when the government borrows and they take on debt, that's a liability, right? They take on debt, they have to pay someone back. Dollars also are a liability of the government. So it used to be the case that if you um, had dollars, you could go to the government and say, I want gold because it was backed by gold. We're now in a fiat money system, which means that dollars are not really backed by anything. So if you go to the government and say, I want something of real value in exchange for my dollars, they might give you a government bond. Um, and then you say, oh, I don't want your government bond, then they'll give you dollars back. So that is what a fiat system is. That most countries aren't in a fiat system. Um, you can get sort of more inflation when you are sort of off the gold standard because the currency is not anchored to anything. However, it's not really necessary. And in the past, being anchored to gold can cause various problems. The value of a dollar would depend on how much gold is produced or found in a given year. So it turned out that was just in the long run, in a modern world, not a great way to run a sort of monetary system.
I think we also had the question of, no, I asked who measures inflation, didn't I?
Maybe not yet. So
No.
yeah,
Okay.
there are some private sector measures. Some people are just on the internet trying to collect all the prices and measure how much prices go up. But for the most part, it's the government. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics it produces the Consumer Price Index, and then there are other government agencies that measure it in slightly different ways.
Okay, and I think you were saying last night something about the press also.
Right. So there are two main. So I mentioned the Consumer Price Index already. So that is the price index that you sort of hear about in the news. Uh, the Federal Reserve, which has the mandate for stabilizing prices, uses a slightly different index for um, for measuring prices. They call it the Personal Consumption Expenditures Chain Weighted Index. It's a mouthful. Um, and basically, what that measure does is there's a bunch of things in the economy that are kind of hard to measure. So, for example, you often don't really pay for financial services directly, but somehow the government wants to know what the price of people who are running banks and trading stocks do. And so they have to impute a price for that. Uh, the PCE index also takes some weight or puts some weight on, I'm sorry, it takes into account that people switch what they spend on over time. So the CPI, that first one that I mentioned that you will hear about in the news, will say, okay, what do people spend their money on and how much did those prices go up? The PCE, the one that the Fed uses, takes into account that people over time they switch their spending to things that are getting cheaper. So as TVs get cheaper, for example, people buy more of them, and you can, if you were around 20 years ago, you maybe had one television screen in your house. Now we have 18 screens in our houses, right? So the PCE index that the Fed tracks, it has some advantages for some technical reasons that come out of economic theory. But the main thing to know is PCE it puts more weight on things that get cheaper over time, and it generally is a little bit lower than the CPI. So when the Fed says we want to have 2% inflation, we want to have a 2% growth rate in the PCE index, which usually translates to around 2.5% in the CPI index.
Uh-huh. And that is something to remember.
Yeah,
The consumer price index will look a little higher than what the Fed is actually using.
exactly.
And you also said there was something about how companies set prices.
Right. So in general, the Fed is trying to keep inflation at 2%, but it's not always there. And when thinking about what causes inflation or at least influences inflation, we do want to think about ultimately what it is that how it comes to be. And so inflation is prices going up. Who set prices? Companies are setting prices. So when thinking about what are the sources of inflation ultimately, it's helpful to go like to the company level and think what are actually companies thinking about when they're setting a price. Um, this is a good moment, I think, to kind of bring in COVID, just because in the last few years we had a lot of inflation, and I think the example can help you think through what are these sort of different sources. So what are companies doing? They produce things, they sell it, they have some costs. You could think about, excuse me, their costs are mostly wages and materials in some way. So when you buy a sandwich, some of that $10 or what is probably now $14 goes to wages. Some of it goes to buy bread and the tuna salad and so on. And then some of it is kept as margins. So when companies are setting prices, more or less, companies usually like to have a relatively constant margin over their costs. So, if their costs are $10 to make a sandwich, they'll sell it for 12. If the costs go up to 20, they would want to sell for 24. So it kind of stays in constant proportion. And so then we can think about what are things that affect these costs. So one of them is that the macroeconomy as a whole is supply shocks. So one of the things that we experienced in the last few years, so when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a big drop in amount of oil and wheat that were sold across the world. And so gas prices and food prices went up in response. So, if you're a restaurant, you're making sandwiches, now you have to pay more for your bread, but the company that's delivering your bread is paying more for gas. And so it's going to work its way through the chain. Firms are going to face higher costs of producing, and they're going to pass that on to customers. There's another sort of genre of things that can affect inflation that we can put in the bucket of demand. So when take like the stimulus checks that we got, or I forget what the Biden administration, they called them, they didn't call it stimulus, but they were functionally stimulus checks. Is that people had more money and then companies were selling more, but they were also hiring more workers. So that pushed up wages. And when wages are higher, that's a cost for firms. And if firms want to keep a constant margins over their costs, as wages go up, they'll raise prices as well. So those are the kind of two
Hmm.
big
Let me
factors
ask
that the supply and the demand.
something. You've been using the word margin. Is that what we often call profit, or is there a difference?
There can be a difference. So you might think that the margin is, you can say, how much does it cost to make this sandwich? You had to pay some workers to do it. You had to um, buy the bread and the tuna salad. What that's left over might not only go to profit to that company, because those margins might cover other kinds of costs as well that are not just the cost of making this particular sandwich. So maybe that company has a loan. They had to get a loan to get started, so that margin will in some way pay off the interest on that loan. Companies also maybe purchased capital. So maybe they bought a bunch of equipment that they bought 10 years ago, and in some ways the margin is kind of covering those costs of paying for that capital in the first place. And then some is left for profit. And in the end, how much of margins sort of cover these other kind of costs versus end up as profit is often very hard to measure. So we can measure margins, but how much that ends up profit in the long run is not always an easy equation. So there was a few other things that I wanted to mention with when firms setting prices. So one big question that and a debate coming out of COVID was how much of the inflation was generated by companies just price gouging. And one of the things that can affect that margin that companies have over their costs is the competitive environment that they're in or how price sensitive customers are. So one of the things that we saw during COVID is there were a lot of supply chain issues. A lot of companies simply could not produce something because they could not get necessary parts to arrive. And what that means is that if you're a company and usually you're setting a price, if you charge more, you make more money, but if you charge more, you also might lose customers. During COVID, because a lot of companies were sort of maxed out on how much they could produce, they could raise prices without losing customers. And this was something that was reported even in company earnings reports was CEOs would report to shareholders, usually when we raise prices, people stop buying things. But right now we're raising prices and they keep buying things. So I think especially early on in the pandemic recovery, so particularly 2021, is where we saw corporate profits shoot up a lot and prices shoot up very quickly as well.
Now, I know it seemed a little odd to me, but people were very upset about inflation, and yet I lived through the late 60s and 70s when in fact inflation was much higher in many years. So to me, in a way, it was like coming home. This is the way things are.
Yeah, perhaps some of the reason why the increase in prices the last few years was so jarring was just because there hadn't been for like most people maybe under the age of 50 just had not experienced everything getting more expensive all at once like that before. In countries where prices are not very stable, there's in general a lot of inflation. I think people get into a different mindset of, the prices don't really mean anything in particular because they might change, one month to the next. If prices have been stable for a very long time, people can get kind of attached to a particular number that like there is a price that's sort of a fair price for this thing. A beer should not be more than $6, right? And if that's been the price for a while, then you have some associations that that's what the price should be, and then it feels unfair or something the system is doing something wrong when that changes. So yeah, I think if you grew up with prices changing a lot, it's just, no big deal. That's just how things go. But if you're used to generally pretty stable prices, it can be um, pretty jarring.
Well, for that matter, I also lived for a couple of years in former Yugoslavia, which had wild inflation far beyond anything I think far beyond anything we've ever seen in the United States. And life still seemed pretty good.
Mm.
One thing was that people did a lot of borrowing and buying on credit because you could have something, and by the time you got around to paying it, in essence, it cost much less because you were paying what you had promised to pay, not
Mhm.
what the new price was.
Yeah, which is much higher. Yeah, and people can adapt. Like in Turkey, I think we've seen a lot of inflation over the last few years. They've taken a sort of an unconventional way of managing inflation and then ended up with a lot of it. But they had a lot of economic growth. Argentina also, during some of the periods of high inflation, still had some high economic growth. So yeah, people do have ways that they can adapt. Now, I should say though, this kind of thing that we would call hyperinflation, where prices rise by 1,000%, 10,000%. It's a kind of different genre of inflation than what we face in the US. You can think about what happened in the US as like there was a lot of demand, there were all these supply shocks, companies got a different pricing power, at least for a while. Current hyperinflations happen when a currency sort of just loses its value and people lose faith in the currency itself. And could the US get there someday? Maybe, but because it's such a globally important currency, there's a lot of faith in US institutions as far as making the financial system work. we'd have to try really hard and do a lot of bad things in a row in order to get to a case of currency debasement like that.
Well, apparently, I mean, apparently sometimes inflation is a really bad thing. And I think you might want to say a bit about when that is the case.
It kind of depends on the source of inflation. So, as you kind of were saying, if you're already in an environment where people are pretty flexible and can adjust, know that they need to adjust, then no one really pays attention to the price level because they have other ways of settling transactions. When you have like a supply shock, like what we had with a lot of basic staples getting more expensive, that was inflationary in the sense of it made some things more expensive, and those were also things that low-income people in particular spend a high share of their income on. And so inflation can have redistributive effects where it hits some people harder than others. Um, at the same time, inflation can be very helpful to some people that say you took out a loan, and as a result of inflation, not only did prices go up, but incomes go up. That is something that happened over COVID. On average, wage growth was something like 20-25% over the last couple of years. So if someone took out a loan in 2019, just the value of that loan relative to their income is probably smaller. So you can see this right now for a lot of people who have mortgages. The cost of their mortgage is very low relative to the home value because your prices went up, but their loan was fixed in dollars. So in a lot of ways, inflation it does a lot of redistribution. Some people really benefit. Some people are really hurt by it. Uh, but then there's just the universal part of it of uncertainty of things got more expensive. You don't know where it's going to go next. And I think that is just a cost in and of itself.
So governments try to control inflation, and how do they do that?
So there's a lot of different tools. The sort of governing consensus right now has put inflation management in the hands of central banks. The concerns here is that legislative or positions that are up for re-election might do things that would generate inflation in the long run, more inflation in the long run. So, for example, if you're worried about re-election, you might borrow a lot of money and spend it. So in the short run, more people get jobs, but a couple of years later, that'll catch up with you with higher inflation. So the thinking behind it right now is take it outside of the hands of elected officials, put inflation management in the hands of an appointed or independent agency. So that's what central banks do now. The main tool that they have is to change interest rates. And you may have heard this expression about inflation of too much money chasing too few goods. That's not quite the right way to think about it. The better way to think about it is it's too much spending chasing too much goods. So people are trying to buy lots of things all at once. Maybe it's people buying consumer goods, companies buying equipment, the government buying services to build roads. And if too many people are trying to buy too much at once, and there's just people are trying to buy more than what the economy can produce, then companies are going to say, look, I can't produce anymore. My costs are going up, and so I'm going to raise prices. So that's kind of what we would be worried about as far as demand-driven inflation. And what the Fed does to counteract this is to raise interest rates. And the thinking here is when borrowing is more expensive, you're less likely to make big purchases that you would need borrowing for, which is mostly buying a house or buying a car. So if interest rates are up, you don't buy, maybe you don't buy a house or you don't move or you stay renting. And then because you didn't buy the house, you didn't pay the realtor, you didn't buy furniture, you didn't, go to Home Depot to buy a bunch of things. And so your spending goes down, that creates fewer jobs, that creates lower spending and so on, which, lowers pressure on prices. One of the shortcomings of sort of the interest rate policy is that it's a very blunt tool. So it really impacts just a few sectors very hard, namely construction and cars. And it has really big redistributive effects. So if you're a borrower and interest rates go up, you're going to be paying more. If you're a lender, you make more money when interest rates are higher. So there are proposals to use other tools to manage inflation as well. So rather than affecting interest rates, you could just regulate credit directly. You could say, if I want less spending and less borrowing, I could just change the rules on banks so they can lend a little bit less. And the federal government itself could change how much it taxes and spends. So if the economy is doing poorly, the government can spend more. If there's too much inflation, uh, the way the government spending and taxes would help with that is to either spend less or to tax more. Now, you can see why, though, if inflation is high, if you want to lower inflation with taxes, you'd want to raise taxes, but you can see why it's politically difficult to raise taxes when inflation is high. So, and I guess the last tool that had been used a lot in the past is price controls. Um, as far as if you're in a general inflationary environment, one of the challenges with price controls is that the demand is still there. So you're going to have shortages of whatever is that you cap the price on. Um, and so what people have found is that when you end a price control, then the price just shoots right back up. So I think in general, if you want to use price controls, to deal with inflation, then the government should also try and be involved with deciding how to actually ration, the scarce things that people are demanding, and also think about the production side, right? Ultimately, if prices are going up, uh, you have people that are demanding more than is being supplied, and if government can do things to actually smooth out how much stuff is available to be produced, that might be a way to deal with inflation, particularly in targeted sectors.
Thank you, Justin Bloesch. Uh, I guess we've learned a lot about inflation and what can be done about it and when it's helpful and when it's bad. Um, Not always bad. I think that's one lesson to learn. You are nodding.
Yes, yeah.
And let's see. And I think we also learned that it doesn't really directly come from the government in power, but rather from the people who were appointed at an earlier, somewhat earlier stage.
I think
And
that's right. I mean, yeah, the a lot of policies, the effect when it generates inflation, it can be often years later.
thank you, Justin Blesh.
Mhm.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.